It's a pleasure of being here tonight, and basically all I know I learned from a cow. So I grew up in southern Ontario, and I was used to having to work with round bales, like the little wee ones, and square bales, and I found that to be a real pain in regards to feeding cattle in the wintertime. So when I started with Ag Canada in Melfort a long time ago, we started looking at different ways of wintering cows, and that's when the round bales first came in, and we did a lot of work on that. But the whole point was, how much does it really cost to run a cow for the wintertime? And the other big question is, where are we going to get our winter feed? So it's much cheaper to graze than it is to feed cows. So we want to be able to extend the grazing season as far as possible. And the big thing is that what we do before grazing or in between grazing events is probably more important consideration than what happens during the grazing time. And as Greg has mentioned, resting the plant is the only way for sustaining a high production year after year. Now, Andre Voisin, back at the turn of the century, was a French biochemist and a farmer, and he learned a lot from just watching his cows. And he developed 4 grazing rules which universally apply to all types of soil. And his first rule was, before a sward is sheared with the animal's teeth, for the sward to achieve its maximum productivity, sufficient intervals must have elapsed between 2 successive shearings to allow the grass to accumulate in its roots the reserve necessary for vigorous regrowth and to produce its blaze of growth. The second rule that he talked about is the total consumption or occupation period on one paddock should be sufficiently short for the grass to be sheared on the first day of occupation and not to be cut again by the teeth of these animals before they leave that paddock. And I think Greg has also alluded to that. His other 3 and 4 rules was basically dealing with the animals. And the animals with the greatest nutritional requirement must be helped to harvest the greatest quantity of grass of the best possible quality. And the cow's milk yield will be at a maximum if the cow stays in one paddock for a short period of time. Now, if you're interested, Voisin's work is in a book. It's been published in many, many different languages. It's been reprinted many times, but it is available on the internet and you can read it there. So with those kind of thoughts in mind, I want to take us back to when I first started with Ag Canada in Melfort, Saskatchewan. And we had a big community pasture research project on community pasture land. And in Saskatchewan, the community pastures are basically all been seeded. So we're going to be talking about seeded species here and not the native species that Greg has been talking about. So this was basically the first pasture to plate system kind of in Canada. And we looked at all different things to do with cow-calf operations and grazing, that sort of thing. So we had a big crossbreeding program. We looked at January, February versus April, May calving. We started work with rotational grazing. We did a lot of work with fertilizer. We looked at extension of the grazing season. We had all sorts of work looking at different forage species. We looked at remote sensing. We did some of the early work on the electronic identification of cattle, and we also had a large brush management program. So when we started, or when they started to work with bushland pastures, this is the kind of equipment that we would use to break the land and to reseed. Previously, the land had been stripped of the aspen trees and brush piled and burned. And then the following year, we bring in this heavy equipment to try and seed. So we're talking about rough land. We're talking about boulders. We're talking about tree roots, lots of sticks, and we needed lots of heavy equipment. We looked at some drills. This is the rangeland drill, but we also looked at a drill that we brought in from BC. This was the Brilliant Cedar. And then later on, we basically found that on these old pastures, if we left them to grow all summer long and we didn't graze them until the fall, then over time, we were able to bring those pastures back without having to go in and break and reseed, so that one would have to get down on their hands and knees and look at the plants that are available. And if we were in like a brome, alfalfa, bluegrass stand, if we could find some alfalfa plants and some brome plants, if we left it to late fall, then over the years, we were able to bring those pastures back without having to go in and break and reseed. The other thing we looked at a lot was sod seeding. And we looked at all different kinds of drills from Europe and North America. And we did a lot of work on alfalfa. This was the early stage of the yellowhead alfalfa, very long-lived. And Dr. Shabtai Bittman, who's been previously on this program, he and I did a lot of this work. And so later on, because we were used to having to work in very rough soil conditions, I was looking for some kind of a way that I could sod seed alfalfa in with an existing piece of equipment, because most of the drills that we were previously looking at, A, had to be imported, or B, had to be manufactured. And I was looking for something that was already around that could disturb the soil. So we did a lot of work with the airway unit, where we used it to till in soil, the alfalfa that we had already just broadcast on the surface of the land. We also added in phosphorus, and we were looking at about 30 pounds of phosphorus per acre in that kind of a seeding. And when you put phosphorus in with alfalfa, you're able to get better germination. And we found that alfalfa, the phosphorus, would last about 5 years. So here's a case where we had already sod seeded in, and in that following year, this is the number of plants that we saw. So every flag represents an individual plant. There's the kind of stand that we were able to create. We found that in a situation where we were going to go into sod seed, we wanted to be able to remove as much of the vegetation as possible. Previously, we'd looked at the use of Roundup herbicide, but we found later that if you got the cows to graze the material right down to the ground to reduce competition, then we were able to get the alfalfa to establish. We also found that if the cows went into the area after it was seeded and really trampled the area, that also helped to get the contact with the seed and the soil for further growth. So all of that information is involved in a booklet that we put out called Sod Seeding. It's available in Manitoba. It was Manitoba Agriculture that helped us put it together. And it's also available on the internet that you can read. So everything in there that we found on the sod seeding work is in that publication. So with our original seeding at Pathlo, we seeded crested wheatgrass into these stands, and we wanted to have it for early spring grazing. So in our situation, then we would graze the crested wheatgrass first, and then after that was finished, then we would put it on to the brome, alfalfa, bluegrass pastures. We also did a lot of work with fertilizer, and we found that if we fertilized with 80 pounds of N, 45 or 40 pounds of P on alternate years, we could greatly enhance the forage production. There's the kind of stand that we would get with no fertilizer. And when we fertilized, we would get about 2.5 to 2.75 times more forage because we had fertilized. And then because we were doing it in alternate years, we found the following year that we would get about 1.5 times more forage in those stands than we did with no fertilizer at all. The other big thing was that in years of drought, we found that it was the fertilized paddocks that really saved us, and that we were able to get 2 grazings on those paddocks, whereas with the non-fertilized paddocks, we were only able to get 1. So then, as I mentioned before, then it was advantageous for us to fertilize those paddocks, and the non-fertilized paddock could only be grazed once in the periods of drought. We also found that the larger grasses, in other words, we're talking about the brome, were more fully applicable to applications of phosphorus and S or sulfur, and it was the finer grasses that were then prevailed over these. And so that was the taller grasses then that we were able to get the increase in the sward response because of the fertilizer. And our big goal was to have big calves at weaning time coming off that kind of land. Now, the other thing that we need to think about, and Greg's mentioned to us, is that for every day you graze too early in the springtime, you basically use 3 days of grazing in the fall. And this basically came from some work from the late Hugo Gross at the Brandon Research Station many, many years ago. So that what it boils down to is that you want to be able to, on a seeded pasture or a tame pasture, be able to look at the 3-leaf stage before you start the growth. As Greg has alluded, the 3.5 leaf stage is basically for native grasses. And we found that it was advantageous that you alternated the pastures that you grazed first, that you first grazed each spring. In other words, one spring you graze paddock A, the next spring you would start with paddock B and orient it that way, rather than always going into that same pasture for the first graze each spring. The other thing that we looked at was we fertilized on alternate pastures each year. And initially, for the initial graze, we wanted to have it about 3 to 7 days, as Greg has previously mentioned, so that you could get all the paddocks grazed, the top grazed of all those plants before you set it into the second period of grazing. And that was basically so that you would keep the plants from going to maturity too soon. Also, as Greg's mentioned, this is a very famous slide, and the bottom line is, I want you to remember that you get as much plant growth above the ground as you do below the ground. And that's extremely important because it's the roots that drives the system. So the plant on the far left, that was continually being clipped, whereas the one on the right was allowed to establish beyond the 3-leaf stage, and that's the amount of roots that you get. This work was done by a friend in southern Saskatchewan, where he looked at meadow brome grass doing the same kind of things. And that's the kind of growth that he was getting there, where he clipped the plant once, twice, or 5 times during the season. That was on meadow brome, and this was on smooth brome. So the same kind of thing is happening. You want to have lots of roots driving that whole system because that's what drives your system. And that all ties into carbon sequestration, which everybody is interested in. And in carbon sequestration, it's basically the amount of root mass that you have in the soil. That's what's sequestering the carbon. So the more roots you have, the more carbon sequestration you get. Along that same line, and especially in the native areas, is you want to be able to look at the amount of litter that you have on the soil. And that's a major thing in regards to drought management. So litter then basically shades the soil, it cools it down, it traps the snow, it increases water infiltration, it reduces the raindrop impact. In other words, if you have no litter there, the splashing will move the soil around. And on the rangelands in Western Canada then, especially in the areas of scarce moisture, 50% of your yield, basically in the brown and the dark brown soil zones, really depends upon having adequate litter there. And again, some work that was done in Saskatoon, they found that for every kilogram of carryover, there was an increase of about 20% in yield coming that next year. And that was basically because of the litter was increasing the water infiltration. And here is basically a small picture of what we're talking about. Greg's talked about it too, where you've got the litter covering up the soil. And 50% of that yield in a mixed grass stand is basically coming because of the litter. And in the foothills country in drier years, it accounts for 30% of the yield. So the big thing is the function of litter. It cools the soil surface, it enhances water infiltration, and it retains the scarce moisture. So in this particular case, we have a rangeland in southern Alberta that's been fairly well grazed back, whereas on the left-hand side, we've got lots of plant material, and that's basically what you're looking for. In our case, then, on gray wooded and black soils in Milford and Lacombe, this was the kind of forage stand of the meadow brome that we were looking at going into the fall. Now, rotational grazing is also a drought-proofing method that in times when you are facing drought, you can slow down your rotation and be able to extend your grazing season that way. And as we've mentioned before, we want to have a rest between those paddocks that are being grazed. We want to alternate the spring pastures. And in some cases, you might want to sacrifice a paddock for early spring grazing, but you want to be able to leave that paddock then to be able to come back to its normal state before it's grazed again. And you want it to make sure it's basically in that 3-leaf stage or more before it's grazed. We've done a lot of work in looking at ways of extending the grazing season. And this was for seeding annuals. And we want to be able to seed our annual crop early in the springtime to make use of that available moisture. And as Greg has pointed out before, here's what pastures look like. The dark green areas being the pasture being produced. The pasture needs are in blue, so that we find that in August, September, and October, we're basically in a pasture shortfall when we're looking at a seeded pasture situation. If we then superimpose some annual information on top of that, we find that if we plant barley, it's kind of early in that June, July area. Oats comes a little bit later, and then the winter cereals comes along. And then with the Italian ryegrass, it's really available for that later part of the fall. So what we were looking at, we were in a silage situation at Milford. So we looked at underseeding all these to silage crops. But if you're in a green feed type of situation, you can do the same kind of thing. So in that kind of situation then, we underseeded fall rye, winter wheat, winter triticale, and oats, all under a silage situation. And we were looking at that intercrop then as a regrowth that we could graze in the fall after we took the silage crop off. So those are some of the different crops that we looked at over time, and they all worked extremely well for being able to provide fall growth for cattle to graze. We also looked at annual legumes, and we found that big Bernstein clover worked extremely well in our area, as well as crimson clover. And these were some of the other legumes, annual legumes, that we found out that would work quite well on the gray wooded or black soils in the Milford and Lacombe area. So that's something that you can look at in your own situation. Now, there's been a lot of interest in the press and in the public domain about seeding all sorts of combinations of annuals for grazing. And my big concern is that we need to kind of look at the cost of what that is providing a grazing day, so that if your association was interested, this might be something you might want to have a project on, is looking at what is the actual yield and what is the actual grazing day cost of having those different crops available in combinations for fall and winter grazing. Some other work that Vern Barron did at the Lacombe Research Station was looking at the role of alfalfa and fertilizer. And basically he found that with high rates of alfalfa being seeded, you could save about 100 kilograms of nitrogen per year because of the benefits of the alfalfa in that kind of a sward, providing nitrogen to those plants. Now, the other thing is that if you're in a situation that you're short of grass, then there's different things that you can do in order to get around that during the summertime. One of the things, if you're really short of grass, it would be just grazing during the grazing season. The other thing would be able to wean your calves early, let the cows graze longer, but you want to have them entering the winter in good condition. Or there's been some work by Christoph Weider at University of Alberta found that you could wean your calves as early as 90 days, but they needed to be trained to drink water and consume high energy feed if you're in a situation of really short feed supply. We looked at some of the different values of extending the grazing season, and one of the big projects we did at Melford was putting receiver calves in the fall on these pastures in the fall. In other words, we had Italian ryegrass pastures available. We put half of the calves that were received to the feedlot into the feedlot directly. The other half were put on the pastures, and we grazed in October and November. And we found that we had basically no health problems with the calves that were out grazing, whereas we had a lot of health problems with the calves that were in the feedlot. And we found it was cheaper to background those calves in the extended grazing than it was in the feedlot. So here are some of the calves at the Lacombe site where we're grazing wean calves late in the fall on the Italian ryegrass. And it worked quite well. We grazed up into the snow, and that was quite successful. Here is back where we had half the calves in the feedlot in the Melford area, and that system worked well. The other big thing in any of this fall cereals being planted with silage or green feed is that you want to remember to seed your crop early. You want to be able to make use of that moisture. You want to be able to make use of the heat units during the summertime. Now, good quality fall grazing will reduce your winter feed costs. And we found that with our cows coming off the community pastures in the fall, we would put them on extended grazing pastures at Melford, and the cows would put on body weight and put on condition before they were going into the wintertime. It's important in your operation, if you already don't do it, but you want to be able to estimate the amount of back fat that you have on those cows. You want to be able to segregate them into different groups for wintering. And you don't want your cows coming into the wintertime in that kind of a condition. Big thing is, how are we going to winter those cows? How are we going to get them through the winter? Gary Matheson and I at the University of Alberta over the years have done a lot of work in looking at fat and thin cows going into the wintertime. And we basically found that cows going into the wintertime in good body condition require basically 50% less feed over the wintertime than those that are in that thin condition. And we want to be able to look at this in being able to reduce our overhead wintering costs and how best to manage that. So we've done a lot of work with swath grazing at Melford and at Lacombe, and winter grazing really pays. And we're looking at developing systems where we can graze for 300 plus days a year. So at Melford, we started looking at swath grazing and then followed that up at Lacombe. And we looked at oats and barley, winter tritti, kale, corn, and it all worked extremely well. We were able to graze successfully in about 18 inches to 2 feet of snow, as long as the cows could find the rise in the snow where the swaths were. They would quickly go in, clean off all the snow, and then resume grazing. We used an electric fence to control the amount of area that we were using, and we basically compared this to a straw silage-based ration for our control cows. And we did that over a number of years. The big thing is to be able to control the amount of grazing using an electric fence. I find as I drive through the country, there's a lot of swath grazing going on, but the cows are grazing a whole section of land or a quarter section. And the biggest problem there is that the cows will go in, they will clean off all the grain heads first, and then all they'll have left to do for the rest of the winter is the straw. And so we all know that that's not good nutrition. So we set our system up that we would move that fence every 3 to 5 days, and we would provide enough material so the cattle would clean it right down to the ground. We used the tumble wheels that worked extremely well. The fiberglass post also worked very well, and I would use an auger bit and a portable electric drill, and that was my fence post driller, and I could set in the fiberglass fence post, and that worked extremely well. The other big thing is to have a very good grounding system on your electric fence system, and that meant having 3 10-foot ground rods in your system. So that's basically what our fields looked like after the cattle had cleaned them up. And as you can see, we're getting very good utilization there. This was rendered critically. It worked extremely well, and the cows liked it, and it panned out extremely well. We also did some work, and Vern did most of this work in looking at corn grazing. You need to have enough heat units in your area to grow corn successfully, and corn is expensive, so you need to look at what's it actually costing you to graze those cattle on corn over the winter time. And that was the aftermath of our corn grazing at the home. Now, the bottom line in all of this is that after calving, cows need to be on a rising plane of nutrition. This is extremely important. It's the after calving nutrition that's the important. And in this case, then, in the early days at Lacombe, we saved some of those swaths for early spring grazing so that we could get the cattle out of the wintering pens, and we would supplement those cows on that kind of land. At Melford, we were in a situation where we were all in pens, and our cattle didn't go to pasture until mid to late June, so we were supplementing them with silage and grain. Here at the Brandon Research Station, they find that in early summertime, they get, or midsummer, they get a hot spell and their perennial grasses aren't available to them, so that they look at grazing their swaths in midsummer as a means of being able to extend their grazing seasons later in the fall onto the perennials. We also looked at grazing perennials under the snow, and the Grey-Wooded Forage Association here in Alberta set up a project where they seeded all sorts of different kinds of forages in the fall in big, long strips, and then they cross-fenced it, and then they let the cattle go and choose where they wanted to graze. And they found basically that the cattle concentrated on anything that was sticking through the snow, and that system worked extremely well. So Vern Barron then at Lacombe then looked at this under plots, and these pictures are all taken in February. They were in pots under the snow, and we brought them in and photographed them. But look at the amount of green material available on those plants, and this is February. So with that in mind, we looked at grazing our meadow-brome grass alfalfa fields at Lacombe in the wintertime and comparing that to our swath grazing of the barley or the oats. And we found that this was the kind of material that was available to the animals. The quality was very good. The biggest problem was that if you had ice buildup and big snow buildup, it was difficult for the cows to get at this material. But once they cleaned the snow off, they could graze everything right down to the ground. And again, we used the electric wire to control the amount of grazing. The bottom line on all of this was that we find that it's more advantageous to graze your fall pastures using your perennial forages rather than in the wintertime, because we found that with the alfalfa, we lost all the leaves off because of the wind damage. We did not lose any plants because we grazed them in the wintertime, but economically, we were not able to get the grazing days on the brome alfalfa pastures in the wintertime as compared to the oats or the barley or the triticale. So bottom line, graze your perennial pastures, your seeded pastures in the fall, save the swath grazing for the snow in the wintertime. There's a lot of work going on about bale grazing. A lot of people do it. These are in northern Alberta. These are around the Lacombe area. Bale grazing works in that kind of a situation. The big idea is to be able to control the amount of wastage you have In this particular situation, they were using the round bale feeders to go around those bales, as well as the electric fence to be able to mount waste. Here's the area again where the cattle are laying down. And there's a picture of the aftermath of bale grazing coming into the springtime. So the process works very well. Now, Vern Barron then at Lacombe is able to look at all our data. And if you look at the number of pasture grazing days or the number of cow days per hectare, we find that we are able to get the most on the triticale pastures, followed by the corn and the oat pastures. And on our grass pastures, we were getting quite low numbers. So those are the kind of things that you want to look at is what is the number of cow days you can get per acre or per hectare, and what's it costing you to have your cows out on those lands at that point in time. If we look then at our 300-day or 300-plus day grazing season, then we find that in June, July, August, September, we're rotationally grazing our perennial pastures. We're going into the fall and the weeding period. We're grazing crop aftermath. We're grazing our intercrop coming from our silage crops or our round bale for our green feed that we've intercropped in. Then in the wintertime, we've got our stockpile forage, our bale grazing or our swath grazing. And then coming into the springtime, then we've got our early species or our stockpile forage that we can look at. We put together a very good book on year-round grazing. Again, this is available on the internet. And this interviewed basically a whole series of farmers in the Alberta situation that did different things for extending their grazing season and to be able to look at the 365-day grazing around the clock. Here's another book that we put together, Management of Canadian Prairie Rangelands, and this concentrates more on the rangelands of Western Canada and what you can do there. And there's a lot of really good information on range management in that publication. And again, you can find that on the internet. So over the years, I've been really concerned about feed wastage and looking at round bale feeders. We looked at all different kinds of designs. And this particular round bale feeder was made in Pennsylvania. I've been encouraging people in Alberta and Western Canada to try and make a deal with them to be able to make them here. But these cone style type round bale feeders is the most efficient as far as feed wastage and feeding round bales, because the droppings go into that inner tub and the cattle are able to eat it that way. So extremely good feeder. Now, Barry Aremcio, I believe he was on one of the earlier programs, and Ken Ziegler from Alberta Agriculture and ourselves, we had a big project at home a number of years ago looking at the traditional way of feeding cows on snow, because everybody does it. And we looked at bale processors, we looked at bale on winders or bale on winders. And what they did is they put tarps underneath the snow in the fall, and then in the springtime they were able to lift the tarps up, and they were able to go through that, separate the manure from the residue that was left over, and they were able to quantify the amount of feed being waste. And if you looked at the dust particles coming out of the bale processor and the scattered specks on the snow, those are all high nutritious pieces of forage that are being lost. And so they found that they were losing anywhere from 20 to 30% of the feed value in using these methods of feeding the cattle on the snow. And so that in the real world, you needed to be able to increase the amount of forage by 20 to 30% going into those kind of units in order to create, make up for those losses. And there's, again, pointing to some of the losses on the snow, which the cattle cannot get at. And there's some more of it there. In your area and in a lot of areas in southern Saskatchewan and Alberta, there's a lot of issues about riparian. And the bottom line there is that we find there's too much grazing for too long and too often in these riparian areas. And the other thing is the whole fact about the public not liking to see cattle in streams because of pollution. Now, Doug Vieira at Kamloops Research Station a number of years ago set up a study where he monitored cattle, and the cattle had the choice between drinking out of a stream as opposed to drinking out of a water trough when the water was pumped from the stream into the water trough. And this is what he found. He found that, by and large, cattle preferred, when they had a choice, to drink out of the trough as opposed to the creek. So that may be something you can look at in your area if you're in a riparian area that's being overgrazed and you want to be able to do something about it. In looking at finding solutions for riparian areas, these are kind of the things that you can look at. Some are more costly than others. Some require less labor, but there are different things that you can do to minimize the amount of time that cattle are in a riparian area. So we have to look then is what are the bottlenecks in your area of looking at forage production. We're always going to have drought in the future. We just don't know when. But basically, in large, you're going to get the most of your forage grown by the 1st to the 15th of July. So at that point in time, you need to make a decision on what are you going to do in regards to furthering fall grazing and going into the wintertime. So if you have to depopulate, if you have to go out and buy feed or buy hay, you need to be able to do it prior to that time, because that's basically what you're going to see in your fields. So when you look at the future, one of the big things that I see is that in years of abundance, it's really necessary to save feed for the years of drought. And these bales previously, a few years ago, in our local auction market just up the road from Ponoka, were selling for $180 each. And the big question is, can you really afford to have your hay or your straw looking like that when it's a value of $100 to $180 a bale? We found at Melford and Lacombe, we looked at all conceivable methods of storing round bales. And the only one that really works is to have an airspace between the bales so that they're not touching. We found that when the bales were configured in this way, the water would run off the top bales into the bottom bales on the sides and would create a solid ice mass. So that in those years of drought, it's really important to cover that hay up, put it in a shed if you have access to it. But if you have to lay it out in the open, try and pick the driest space you can find on your ranch or your farm. In some areas, we would have raised areas that we had sloped for drainage, but we would have the bales so they did not touch each other. We find that with the bale wagons, with the bale unloaders, when they're being unloaded, they will butt touch. And we found that if you have to winter those or summer those bales over into the next winter, the rain will infiltrate between those bales, and we would get as much as a foot to 18 inches of rot in both the ends of those bales. So you really can't afford to do that. So the whole idea is to be able to look at these systems. You want to be able to lower your production costs. You be able to manage for times of drought. If we look back in history, we found that the buffalo, they came into the Aspen Parkland area in the fall and the winter time, and that's where they would winter. We find that using those ideas, cows can do the same thing. And I hope that these are some ideas that you can use on your own outfit in order to be able to have a successful grazing season, be able to lower your winter costs, and go from there.